So, hi everyone. My name is Jamie Harris with Business Connect. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. If you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, we would love to hear your name, where you are located right now, where you're joining us from, and any other info that you'd like to introduce yourself. And later, when Andrew is presenting, if you have a question about his presentation, you can put that in the Q&A. So they are two separate spots for those things. And I will probably repeat myself later, but I'll go ahead and get it started. Thanks for joining the second webinar in the Wash Cycle webinar series with Business Connect. Business Connect leverages a market-driven approach to improve health, education, and economies by equipping individuals with life-enhancing products. We are a social enterprise, so we do value making a profit, and we also value having a social impact in the world. So part of this webinar series, the goal is just to learn, and on our end, Business Connect would love to learn more from global experts as we dive into more WASH topics, as we explore real world solutions in clean water, sanitation, and hygiene. These events are meant to connect us with professionals and communities and connect academics to practitioners and everyone who is working towards meaningful, lasting impact in WASH. We want to be a place of learning and connection for that. So we're so glad that you joined us today. My name is Jamie Harris. I am the head of research at Business Connect, and I studied civil and environmental engineering at the University of Virginia, specifically for improving the technical performance of household water treatment. So that was a super fun experience, and I've been able to take that with me at Business Connect now. And I'm super excited to be joined by Professor Andrew Brower today. He is an assistant professor of epidemiology at the University of Michigan. He has his PhD in applied and interdisciplinary mathematics and an MA in statistics. He has always loved mathematics, but has been drawn to working on real world problems where he can be a part of the solution, not the problem. He followed his interest in epidemiology to the mathematics of infectious disease transmission. Much of his work in this area has to do with environmental pathogen transmission, and where most pathogens, except for those transmitted by sexual or skin-to-skin contact, are transmitted through the environment by air, water, fomites, or other pathways. So Andrew's passion and mission is to understand how environmental processes impact the transmission of these pathogens and how that's essential to determine to reduce disease risk. So we're super excited for Andrew to present some of his research today with us. And with no further ado, I will hand it off to you, Andrew. I'll let you share your screen.
Great, thanks so much. Let's see if we can get this going here. Okay, great. Well, as Jamie said, my name is Andrew Brower. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. I really appreciate the invitation to share my work with you today. And it was really exciting to see in the chat this kind of really global audience that we have here. So thanks for being here today. So before we get started, I just want to make some quick acknowledgements. No man is an island, and this work is really part of a broader team. So the core team, including my colleagues, Joe Eisenberg, Matthew Freeman, Marissa Eisenberg, and Monvel Zahid, and collaborators from across Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a number of universities, particularly those involved in the WASH benefits series of trials. So, the reason that we're here today is that water, sanitation, hygiene, or WASH interventions have this really great potential to reduce the burden of diarrheal disease. Unfortunately, when we go to put this into practice and test that these interventions are actually reducing the burden of diarrheal disease. In randomized control trials, which are kind of our gold standard for causal evidence, we actually find that interventions tend to be inconsistent and often ineffective. Can be effective in one location, and the exact same intervention can be not effective in another, or you have slightly different approaches, different products, different community structures, different kind of baseline disease. And that's a challenge, right? We want to be able to predict what types of interventions are going to be effective for specific local contexts. I'm going to be talking a lot about the WASH Benefits Bangladesh trial, which was a very large randomized control trial for water, sanitation, and hygiene interventions funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and run, actually, this is the better part of a decade ago at this point. And what they found was in terms of diarrheal prevalence, baseline in the control arm are a little less than 6% of children with diarrhea, and no significant difference from a water intervention, water storage, and chlorination. It did go down a little bit, but not statistically significantly so. There were some modest improvements from new latrines and hand washing interventions on diarrhea. But they also found that combining the three, water, sanitation, and hygiene, together in a single wash arm was not more effective. And so, at the time and in the context of several other large trials that didn't have the impact that I think the larger field was hoping that they would have, I think there was a kind of a pause for thinking about how do we do better. So what's going on in these trials? What's contributing to the heterogeneity, the difference across the effectiveness of these WASH trials? And so one thing could be efficacy, right? So maybe the interventions that were being trialed just like were not that good at preventing pathogen transmission or some other part of the transmission cycle. It's also possible that there was incomplete compliance. So this might be that the trial failed to provide the intervention, or that the participants weren't actually using the intervention because it was kind of difficult or complicated. The interventions would break, that sort of thing. And so we want to ask ourselves, are people receiving and using the intervention? So that could be a reason that interventions don't work. Another option is that not enough of the community is being covered by the interventions. And so you give the interventions to a couple targeted people, maybe the most vulnerable, but everybody else isn't protected and they're introducing pathogens into the environment. There's also this idea of completeness. So this has to do with how much of the transmission is along pathways that are being intervened on. And so in this example here, we have low completeness. We have a pathogen that is spread by, let's say, chickens and by food and surfaces that you touch. But your intervention is just like a chlorination intervention of household stored drinking water. Well, there's all this other transmission that intervention is not going to block, right? And so how much do you really expect diarrheal prevalence to decrease? And this contrasts with maybe a high completeness set of interventions, perhaps that combine different ways to block pathways. Or perhaps you have a pathogen that's just spread along water. And so maybe that's a better target for a water intervention. There's also this idea that how much disease is already in the community may, or excuse me, how good was the WASH intervention, WASH infrastructure, excuse me, to begin with. So if you're replacing a latrine with a slightly better latrine, you're not going to have as much of an impact as if you're going from a community that practices open defecation to an improved latrine, for example. And so how much that difference is may affect how much you see a reduction in diarrhea. And finally, maybe baseline disease conditions. So does the effectiveness of the intervention depend on the disease burden? Is it more effective when there's a lot of disease in the community, or is it less effective? This maybe isn't clear ahead of time. And so one thing I like to do when I give this talk is to say, take a minute, think about these six topics and say, which do I think are kind of driving uh, maybe the results in a trial of interest. We're going to come back to these specifically for the WASH benefits Bangladesh trial. Of course, it's going to be different combinations for different trials, but maybe think about what your expectations are, and we'll kind of reveal towards the end of the presentation. So one thing I think is useful to think about is that some of these factors are what I'm going to call intervention factors. So they're modifiable by the investigators in some way. So you can build a better water filtration unit. You can somehow encourage people to comply with use the intervention. You can give the intervention to more of the community. You can build the intervention to block more transmission pathways. You can't really do much about the contextual factors. So these depend on the location. So how much disease is in the community? What are the WASH infrastructure already? And to some extent, what is the makeup of the pathogens in the area? Because many of these factors can be driven by differences in pathogen distributions. Diarrhea is not caused by just one pathogen. And so different pathogens, they use different transmission pathways. They have interventions are going to have different efficacies. So chlorine is much more effective for certain types of pathogens than for protists, for example. And so the Global Enteric Multicenter Study, or GEMS, previously found like really big differences in the distribution of pathogens at different sites. So we have really strong prevalence of cryptosporidium at one, where it's almost none in another site, or very little E. coli in one site, but more in another. And so what these differences may be driving many of these both intervention and contextual factors. And so the question is then, what do we do about any of this? So what I'm going to propose is that mechanistic transmission model can aid, probably not completely solve, but can aid in predicting and generalizing WASH trial outcomes to help us better understand what interventions or effects are going to be likely for any specific local context, and how those may translate to other locations. So what we're going to do here is develop a mechanistic model of WASH interventions, particularly in the context of a randomized control trial. We're going to assess the sensitivity of the model to both these intervention and contextual factors. We're then going to take the model and calibrate it to real trial data, the WASH benefits Bangladesh trial. And then we're going to estimate what the trial results would have been in alternative scenarios. Higher compliance, a lower baseline disease prevalence, and different counterfactuals. So let's dive right in here by developing this model of WASH interventions. So this is going to be based on susceptible infectious recovered model, if you're familiar with the kind of SIR model terminology. And so we're going to account for people both who are using the interventions and not using the interventions all in the same community. So we have folks with regular exposure here that are susceptible. They don't have an intervention either because they were not selected for the trial, or they don't have kind of equivalent WASH infrastructure of their own. And they can become infected, and then they can recover. Because this is diarrhea and not necessarily pathogen-specific diarrhea, we tend to think about not permanent recovery, but just you don't currently have diarrhea and you do. You also have people in the community in this trial that have attenuated exposure. And so they may have a different rate of becoming infectious, and then they can recover again. And these folks all are in a community, and so they share certain types of environments. And so people who are infectious shed pathogens into their environment, and there's environmental transmission that people pick up pathogens from the environment and become infected. And this can happen both for people that have no intervention and that do, so that we have to kind of have the systems perspective of everyone in the community at the same time. And we want to distinguish different types of transmission pathways, particularly the ones that are attenuated by the intervention. So like that in that example of completeness, that water pathway was attenuated, but maybe the food or animals pathway is not attenuated by the intervention. So we need to distinguish between those pathways. We also want to account for intervention compliance and baseline wash conditions. I'm going to illustrate that here with, again, the Wash Benefits Bangladesh trial. This is the fraction of participants, both at baseline before the trial and midline and endline during the trial, and the fraction that had an intervention grade latrine. So it's not necessarily a latrine that was given by the trial, but one that was kind of like substantively equivalent. And so what we see actually is about a quarter of participants, even in the control arm, even before the intervention started, had a latrine that was basically as good as the intervention was going to be giving. And so that's important to account for. And then we see that once the intervention deployed these latrines, we have really high compliance. That's kind of to be expected, kind of, I think, 94, 95% compliance. Okay, and so now that we've built this model, we need to understand how sensitive the model is to these different intervention and contextual factors, and maybe how those are going to depend on specific contexts. So we're going to illustrate the sensitivity to the intervention in two scenarios. You can always, there's infinite numbers of scenarios, but I pick these two because they kind of give us a sense of the breadth of the different dynamics that can occur in different locations. So in the first scenario, we're going to have an intervention that has lower efficacy but really high compliance, low community coverage, higher completeness, higher baseline wash conditions, and a lower disease burden. We're going to compare that to a scenario that has higher efficacy but lower compliance, covers more of the community, less complete, no baseline conditions, and higher disease burden. For both of these scenarios both have 50% intervention effectiveness. So after the intervention is applied to the community, there's a 50% reduction in prevalence. The baseline is different between the two. It's a little over 6% in the first scenario, going down to 3, and it's 20% in the second scenario, going down to 10. And so they're apples to apples in the sense of effectiveness, not necessarily apples to apples in these other factors. And so this graph is maybe a lot, but I'll explain it here in a sec. What I want to show is that the sensitivity to one parameter is going to depend on the values of the other parameters. So any point here, this is so the scenario 1 baseline. So that has the 50% reduction, and then we're going to see how different from that 50% reduction we can get. So an additional 50% reduction going into the yellow would mean that we eliminate the disease. So we want to get into the yellow here. We want to get away from the purple. So -50 means that we actually don't prevent any disease. So we want to stay away from the purple. So how do we get from the starting point, A, to the yellow? Well, it's a really short path to the yellow if you increase coverage from this point. So a kind of short direction to get in the direction of the yellow. But if I want to increase compliance to try to get better disease reduction, I'm not going to be able to do as well. It's a much longer pathway to get up to the yellow. You actually never actually can achieve the yellow even with 100% compliance. So we're really, in this example, highly sensitive to coverage. So turning our coverage lever, meaning you give the intervention to a larger fraction of the community, is going to be more effective at reducing disease than getting people that have it already to use it. This is not cost effectiveness because completely understand that it may be a higher cost to give the intervention to more people rather than get the people to use it. But from the perspective of reducing disease, it's more effective to do coverage. However, if we were looking at a different point in space that also had a 50% reduction, we're now down here at point B, and we want to get to the yellow, reduce the disease. So we already have 50% coverage, but we're only at like 35% compliance. Well, at this point, to get to the yellow, we're highly sensitive to compliance. And so you already had given the intervention to a lot of folks. We now need to get them to use it, or actually get it to them so they can use it. And increasing coverage maybe is not as effective at reducing the diarrheal burden. Again, not necessarily talking about costs here, but just in terms of the dynamics. And all of these sensitivities are going to depend on the other intervention and contextual factors. So now if I take this scenario 1 that we were just looking at and compare it to scenario 2, which is the kind of that other very different context, we see that the sensitivities are a bit different. And it's actually much harder in scenario 2 to get to the yellow with either compliance or coverage. Maybe one of the other factors is going to be more effective, but we'd have to look at that overall. Just a quick note, the gray here is just a perverse scenario, meaning that you'd have to like reduce compliance by introducing the intervention, which just doesn't really make sense. People aren't going to not use their already existing wash infrastructure just because you gave them something else. Okay, so what the point of this is to say that it's important to project an intervention's effectiveness for a specific context, and a specific context is actually kind of complicated. And so what we've done here is we've created a public use tool to facilitate planning for local contexts. I'm not going to pretend that this is a like magical tool that's always going to work, but it's here to facilitate some thinking through of what are likely the barriers to disease reduction in given context. So hopefully I've left the QR code up long enough. There's also a web link there. If you're interested, feel free to play around. I'm going to talk through it a little bit now. So on this public tool, you will set your intervention and contextual factors. So these are going to be things like baseline wash conditions. So the proportion of the population with existing wash infrastructure similar to the intervention. So do people already have some version of the intervention, not the intervention itself, but maybe something substantively equivalent? How compliant, both in terms of providing the intervention and then it being used? Are you expecting basic reproduction number? We haven't talked about too much here, but it's the idea of the number of expected cases generated by one case in an otherwise susceptible population. This value really is driving the disease burden. And really, I just kind of use this to calibrate the initial disease burden. We can go through each of the factors, kind of set them there. The model will spit out the expected baseline prevalence and the expected prevalence after the intervention. Um, there will also be a value for how much prevalence will you not be able to reduce based on your intervention. In this case, that it's 0, but if you had a low completeness intervention where there's a lot of transmission on pathways you're not intervening on, it may just not be possible to reduce the prevalence to 0 based on the intervention itself. If you ask for sensitivities, the model will take a minute to think, and it will pop out all of these sensitivities. So looking at each pair of factors, giving this graph of where's the yellow, where's the purple, from where you are. And so you can start to think through, how would I improve disease reduction for this specific scenario? Okay, so now that we've looked at the sensitivity, we want to calibrate our model to some real trial data. Make sure that we're actually capturing real world dynamics here. And so we're going to use the following model parameters. We've really kind of already talked about them. Community coverage, so what fraction of the population is already in the study. We're going to use the magnitude of transmission pathways. This is coming back to this idea of the basic reproduction number. How much of that reproduction number is coming from water, hands and fomites, or some other intervention? Excuse me, some other transmission pathway. And we're going to have parameters for the efficacy of the intervention. So for water, that's chlorination, reducing transmission from the water pathway. For sanitation, that's a latrine with a water seal, reducing shedding into the water pathway. And hygiene, which is hand washing, that reduces transmission from the fomite pathway. What we do is we basically throw spaghetti at the walls, try all of these different combinations of parameters. So we test this very large number of parameter combinations, basically all different values of all of the different parameters. And we reject the ones that don't fit the data very well and keep the ones that do. So I kind of erased here all of these regions that don't fit the data very well. And then we take those ones that do fit the data and we compare it to the data to make sure that our simulation matches the data. So what I have here, again, Wash Benefits Bangladesh, the point and error bars here represent the data, both at baseline before the intervention and at midline, endline after it's applied. And we can see our simulation violins here kind of overlap with the points in each case, kind of indicating that we are reasonably capturing the data. Okay, so we can reasonably capture the data. What do we do with that? How do we kind of get new information? Well, we're going to estimate what the trial results would have been in an alternative scenario. So this is where we're going to go back to the beginning and think about which of those factors was the most important or would be important for improving the intervention outcomes. So it might be efficacy, adherence, coverage, baseline conditions of some sort. So in the original scenario, intervention effectiveness was only about 8% in the water arm and about a third in each of the sanitation, hygiene, and combined water, sanitation, and hygiene arms. So we can ask the model, on average, over all of these points that seem to fit the data, what would be the effect of doubling chlorine or latrine or hand washing efficacy on the intervention effectiveness? What we find is that kind of roughly doubling, but still only a moderate effect of water by doubling chlorine efficacy, and about a 20% increase in effectiveness for any of the other intervention arms. What about full adherence? Actually, it makes almost no difference for the Wash Benefits Bangladesh trial because they actually achieved really high adherence in all of their arms. Everyone was basically already using 80, 90% were already using the intervention as intended. So getting that up to 100%, there's just not going to have that much opportunity for reduction. What about increasing coverage to 20%? We estimate, so this was not formally determined in the trial, we estimate it was about 5%. If we bring that up to 20%, we can get some pretty big gains, at least in the water and the combined water sanitation hygiene arm, with less in the sanitation hygiene specifically. Let's now think about what if there were no baseline conditions. So this is a little bit of a weird counterfactual where we say that like, oh, what if I applied this trial, but nobody had latrines before and nobody had hand washing stations? And what would the disease prevalence would it have been? It would have been higher. I don't know what exactly, what would the effectiveness have been? And in fact, we would think that there would be a reduction in the effectiveness of the intervention, mostly because we find that the farther you are from elimination, the harder it is to achieve a reduction in diarrhea. And so no baseline conditions means higher burden, means harder to achieve an intervention effectiveness. And so kind of similarly, if you had doubling the baseline prevalence, we're going to have a reduced impact on that intervention effectiveness. And so you may say, Andrew, but I guessed that completeness was the most important. So let's talk about completeness for a second. So again, completeness, how much of the transmission pathway is being affected by the intervention? A high completeness means that the intervention is blocking a lot of pathways, or it might just be that most of the transmission is along the one blocked pathway. And what we find, to think about this, let's consider first the impact of increasing coverage. So this is for the water intervention, and as we increase the coverage fraction, we go from this no change up at the top towards disease elimination at the bottom. So you kind of smoothly go down here and achieve disease elimination, somewhere around like 90% coverage for this, which in this case was not a very effective water intervention. And what we see is that completeness is what we call an effect modifier, which means that whether you have high or low completeness is going to affect how much coverage and perhaps the other factors impact that overall intervention effectiveness. So low completeness means that very little of the transmission is along the water pathway. And so you have all of this transmission that the water intervention is not blocking. So you can never really achieve elimination. But if that water pathway is the most of the transmission, so you have high completeness here, the intervention has the potential to block most transmission, you can get elimination earlier and more quickly. And so as kind of, I know covered a lot of ground here, but summary, so we think that coverage is really essential. So interventions tend to have fairly little individual level effectiveness if there's a lot of disease pressure from people that are not being covered by the interventions. And then completeness is an important effect modifier of the impact of coverage, because if the intervention is only blocking a small portion of transmission, there's only so much that coverage and the other factors can do. We find that both efficacy and adherence and fidelity, that is compliance, have some limits to their impact on their own, but are important as part of the larger perspective. And we find that it's easier to have an effect when the system, the kind of diarrheal disease system, is already closer to elimination. And so what we generally recommend is that investments in interventions may need to be addressed in this order. So starting with completeness. So without completeness, addressing the other factors is going to have little impact. And so we need to better understand things like the relevance of food, animals, and other pathways in order to work to eliminate diarrheal prevalence. Then we need coverage. So if we have complete interventions, increasing coverage can dramatically impact outcomes. And then finally, we need to fine tune this with efficacious interventions and good compliance. But these factors really just are not going to do much if you don't already have complete interventions and decent coverage. So some takeaways here. Our transmission models can help us generalize trial relative risks to other contexts. And we can incorporate these transmission models into our trial designs and help us choose programmatic targets for local contexts. That tool that we shared, which again is going to be on the next page, is kind of a first step towards thinking through how to design interventions for one specific context. And we support community level interventions that seek to achieve herd protection. And we find that kind of individual targeting has the potential to really not have that much effectiveness, which is disappointing from the fact that, maybe we will want to target the most vulnerable people in the community. And that's not to say that that will have no effect, but it will have a dampened effect depending on the rest of the community. And we hope to see stronger evaluation of the strength of transmission pathways, including those that are not traditionally covered by WASH. So things like food, for example, are not always covered and particularly prepared food from markets, for example, are not always covered in WASH studies. So I will wrap up there. Here are some links and QR codes to some, both, again, that Shiny app tool and some of our academic work on this topic. And I guess I'll stop there and hand it back over to Jamie to moderate questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. That was awesome. Yes, we do have a few minutes for Q&A, so thank you again for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box below instead of the chat. That'll help us sort through it. We do have a raised hand from Nusrik Rahman, so Nusrik, if you would like to ask your question, I can allow you to talk if you'd like. I can,
Hello,
yes, hi. Nusrik.
hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. I'm actually from Bangladesh, so it's really nice seeing all this research taking place. You know,
Great. Yeah, I'm glad to have you here.
uh, so my question is like, what's the time period for all your assessments? Like, was it over the years or was it on a monthly basis?
Great question. So in this case, there was 1 year apart between each of the assessments. So they measured everything at baseline, implemented the intervention, and then came back 1 year later to assess what the diarrhea and compliance was, then came back 1 year later, approximately, and did it again. So in this case, it's a year in between. I think that the point you're bringing up is a good one, because it may take time for like the disease system to kind of get into equilibrium to account for the new interventions. And it may be that initial changes can decay over time. So people may become less compliant over time. Additionally, an important aspect that we're not directly addressing here, but we would like to in future research, has to do with seasonality. And so, there's important seasonal rains, for example, and that may affect how much transmission is along the water pathway. So at certain times of year, it might be the water pathway may be more important, and at other times it may be less important. So I think that there's a lot of seasonality that has the potential to tell us a little bit more about these disease systems. It's a bit of a challenging area, and I know some folks are working on it currently, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results there. Thanks for your question.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, seasonality is always adds some trickiness to modeling, I'm sure. Here, I will allow Joshua Knight. I'm allowing you to talk if you would like to ask your question. You're more than welcome to take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. And this has been a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you diving into the weeds on this and shedding some light. And my question has to do just with that last research you did. It seemed incredible. And if you could just expand a little bit more on that, how you were able to take this and expand out to the results and the recommendations that you gave. I assume that that wasn't just one study that you did in order to, to kind of make these broad recommendations. If you could just talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. So, yeah, I mean, these broad recommendations are observations of, under the assumption that like this disease system is true, which, it's an approximation. All models are approximations. So, I guess the way that we think about these recommendations are kind of adding to, not necessarily like this is the absolute, word of science on the issue, but to say that coming from the modeling perspective, this is what we think the recommendations would be. To kind of come back to your first question about, well, how do we kind of come about this at all? I'll dive a little bit more into the details here. So if we can imagine each one of these points as being a different combination of efficacy and compliance and baseline conditions, some of them are going to be able to fit the data well, and some of them are not, as we said before. And what we do is we take all of these points and we apply the alternative scenario to them. So we take all of them and we double chlorine effectiveness, or we increase coverage. And they all are going to have different outcomes, right? So we have a wide set of points that are consistent with the data. And now we have kind of a fairly widespread of possible alternatives. And so for the point of this presentation, I did not dive into kind of like confidence intervals or kind of the uncertainty. What I'm showing here are just kind of the mean values. So it could be that for this specific scenario, these are not the numbers that we would see. But based on what a wide number of things that are consistent with the data, the mean effect was these numbers. And so if we had more information, we went back and we tested, some aspect of it and said, oh, well, actually the efficacy of the chlorination was this number. We could maybe narrow down and get kind of slightly better numbers here. And so again, this is for one trial. We would have different results for a different trial, but based on the dynamics of the system, this is generally what we'd expect to see. And this also is not necessarily kind of coming out of thin air. Like this is kind of fairly consistent with what trialists are kind of coming to as a I may not say like complete consensus, but kind of in this kind of pause for conversation after a lot of these really large trials, where I think folks are continuing to land. And so what I would love to see is kind of continued conversation between people who are boots on the ground that really understand and have a kind of that like lived experience of what's working, what's not, where the disconnect between this very like abstract model and what we're seeing on the ground, and conversations with the modelers to kind of have this be as effective a tool for improving on the ground results as possible. So thank you again for coming and for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua, for your question. We do have a cutoff here soon. Thank you so much for everyone's time. If you have another minute, I would love to close us out and share some resources for you all. We did not get to answer every single question, but we will be logging these questions, and I will be sharing with you some contact information here. So if you would like to find a more curated collection of both Dr. Brower's papers and some papers that he cited, then you are more than welcome to check out Business Connect's Knowledge Hub. So you can use this QR code here for checking that out. And I did get a question about, can you put the links to all the QR codes in the chat? We will, in our like follow-up email to anyone who registered for the Zoom, we will make sure we include all the links, and there will be a recording of this presentation on our event page. So if you have any more questions, or if you can't find links or anything of that sort, if you want to ask Dr. Brower a question, I'd be happy to forward it to him. So please email me at jamie.harris@businessconnectworld.com. We really appreciate you all coming. Now we know that maybe we'll make this webinar a little longer so we can have a little bit more time for Q&A, but we want to respect your time. So thank you again so much. And we look forward to having a couple future webinars. We actually have a webinar scheduled September 24th about innovations in menstrual health and menstrual hygiene. So we have panelists who are experts in that space coming to speak on that. So we're always welcome to hear suggestions about more topics, and if you want to participate, we'd love to collaborate. So thank you again, Dr. Brower, for your presentation, and we will be in touch.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Of course. Bye.